This is the moon, around 384,000 kilometers away from the surface of the earth. As of March 2023, only 12 people have walked on this lunar surface, with the last man being Harrison Smith in December 1972. 50 years have passed by since the last man walked on the lunar land. Today, we have computers, phones, high-definition cameras, advanced technology, and wireless communication. But imagine, 60 years ago, when computers were a new thing, America announces to get man to the moon.
To go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best.
Join me on this marvelous adventure of the biggest human achievement in history. This is Man to the Moon, Episode 1, The Space Race. America and the Soviet Union were in a Cold War for many years. It started in early 1947 and went till 1991. During the Cold War, Americans and the Soviet were on a race, a space race. On 4th October 1957, a small probe around 23 inches in diameter was sent to the orbit of the Earth. This was the revolutionary Sputnik 1, which is regarded as the first artificial satellite sent to space, and it was made by the Soviet Union.
The American scientific and intelligence community knew that the Russians would launch a satellite probably in 1957 or 1958. It was also frightening because the ability to launch a satellite was the same as the ability to lob a nuclear warhead.
2 months later, America attempts to launch their Vanguard mission, which was supposedly a response to the Soviet Sputnik. Unfortunately, the Vanguard satellite was a big failure. It rose 2 feet above the ground before it was crumbled into pieces.
The Russians had already had Sputnik, and as a result, the headline the next day when Vanguard blew up was Kaputnik, because we had just disgraced ourselves. So we were in a foot race.
This was a major setback, but the Americans did not stop, and in February 1958, they launched Explorer 1.
Flight command, give take pressurized. Lock take pressurized, missile power. Ignition, stay. Lift off.
Which was America's first successful attempt and the beginning of the space age for the USA. But in 1961, USA again gets behind in the space race. Yuri Gagarin, a Russian astronaut, becomes the first man to go to space. America now needed to do something big. They had to get ahead in the space race. On September 12, 1962, in Rice University in Houston, former American President John F. Kennedy gives a landmark speech that galvanizes the entire nation.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
John Kennedy spoke millions of words in his career as a public servant, but In that speech, there was one verb. It was the verb choose. It said, we choose to go to the moon. And that said something very powerful about American initiative, about America's pioneering experience.
On 22nd November 1963, Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and he would not see his dream to the moon fulfilled.
Empty spaces, what are we living for? Abandoned places, I guess we know the score. On and on, does anybody know what we are looking for? Another hero, another mindless crime behind the curtain, in the pantomime. Hold the line, does anybody want to take it anymore? The show must go on. The show must go on. Yeah. Inside my heart is breaking, my makeup may be flaking, but my smile still stays on.
In 1967, space programs like Mercury and Gemini by America met their objectives, which made NASA more and more confident. In 1961, Mission ES-204, later renamed as Apollo 1, was prepared in record time. To beat the Soviets in the space race, NASA worked really hard and fast to make the Apollo program possible. On January 27, 1967, the crew, which consisted of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, began a trial in the Apollo vessel in real time at the top of the rocket. As soon as the men were inside the sealed command module, the scientists realized that communications with the ground teams were not going really well. The crew reported a noxious odor inside the spacecraft. After 5 hours of running tests, a short circuit was detected. A raging fire began inside the command module. The scientists could not do anything but listen to the crew scream and cry as they burned to death. Here is the recording of inside the spacecraft.
Hey! I've got fire in the cockpit. What is a bad fire?
The crew and NASA paid the price of being overconfident.
Who died in the Apollo 1 fire. He talked to me in 10 days before he died, and the fire. He says, that Apollo spacecraft is a lemon. They got so many things wrong with it. It's going in all directions. It's not safe. We got to get that straightened out.
The spacecraft's interior was melted, and it took them 2 hours to recover the bodies. After this deadly accident, some people lost hope, and many decided to abandon Kennedy's dream of the moon. NASA knew that something is wrong with the module, and they knew that it had the capacity to kill someone, but yet they continued, which resulted in the failure of Apollo 1. At the end, it was decided to review the Apollo program from top to end, and that one key component which stood out in the upcoming Apollo missions was the command module and the service module. The CSM, Command and Service Module, consisted of two basic parts. One which consisted of the fuel, the propulsion system, and life supplies for the astronauts, while the other one would consist of the astronauts. Only the command module would return to the Earth, but the journey would put it to the test. After many successful test missions, a piece of confidential information interrupts NASA's plans. The CIA learns that USSR is preparing for a full manned mission to the moon.
The Russians looked like they were making a push to send a cosmonaut to the moon in time for the anniversary in October of the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution. And the Americans were concerned that they might stick somebody on there and send them to the moon and beat us.
The lunar module, the most important part in the program, which was meant to get detached from the CSM and land on the moon, was far from being ready. The bombshell of USSR's news made NASA prepone their plans in order to be the first to send man to the orbit of the moon. Earlier, Apollo 8 was meant to be a test flight around the orbit of the Earth, but the recent USSR news made them change their plans. NASA takes an outrageous decision to send Apollo 8 to the orbit of the moon without the lunar service module. The Apollo 8 crew, which consisted of Frank F. Borman, James A. Lovell Jr., and William A. Anders, was supposed to spend the Christmas with their families. But now they were about to orbit the moon with no guarantee of success. On December 21st, 1968, the crew is placed at the top of Saturn V rocket. At 7:51 am, the Saturn V rockets lifts off.
We had simulated almost every aspect of the mission with every failure you can imagine, but we did not simulate the actual stresses and vibrations of the initial liftoff. It was just unbelievable. It was so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. It was so violent that it just threw you around like a rat in the jaws of a terrier. But I thought to myself, my gosh, if we missed that part of the simulation, what else have we missed?
Not every aspect of the mission was tested properly, and there was no surety whether the men would return back to their homes or rest in space eternally. Apollo 8 was the riskiest mission in Apollo history because everything was being checked and used for the first time. Soon the spacecraft completes 2 stages of separation and gets into Earth's orbit. Slowly it moves away from the Earth's gravitational pull and they head towards the moon. After 24 hours of the launch, the astronauts enjoyed zero gravity of the space, while the mission control on Earth was still trying to keep things under control. For 32 minutes, the men would be completely cut off from the world and left in the dangers of space. This would happen because Apollo 8 was the first satellite to go behind the moon, and since there was no satellite beyond the moon, there was no means of communication. Apollo 8 was the satellite that would make astronauts see the farther side of the moon with their bare naked eyes. This part of the moon was never seen from the surface of the Earth. Anything could go wrong. Will Apollo 8 be a successful mission or a failure like Apollo 1? We will find that out in the next episode.